Professor of Education at the Autism Centre of Excellence at Griffith University, Australia. With a background in extensive research, she has prolifically published research papers and has more than 40 academic journal papers, books, and book chapters to her name, focusing primarily on ways to enhance participation and engagement of individuals with autism and their families in home, school, and community. Also looking at evidence-based practices, communication, problem behavior, early intervention, and family-centered practices. A member of the editorial boards of Autism, the International Journal of Research and Practice, Australasian Journal and Special Education, and Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, as well as being the Associate Editor of the International Journal of Disability Development and Education. It is our pleasure to welcome Deborah Keen to talk on promoting evidence-based practices.
When I first started out as a psychologist back in the late 1970s, I know that's a long time ago, we knew so little about autism, and we also knew very little about particular interventions that would be effective in supporting individuals to develop their learning and to promote their overall learning and development. And as a consequence of that, amongst other aspects that influenced society at the time, many of those children who had autism were institutionalised. And my very first job in the late 70s as a psychologist was working in such an institution. It had a significant impact on what I chose to do for the rest of my career, and have spent a lot of time being dedicated to looking at ways in which we can promote participation of individuals with disabilities, and more particularly I got an increased focus in autism as I went through my journey, looking at trying to ensure that people could maximise their opportunities in the community. So in the late 90s, I started a PhD, and my research interests were very much on trying to build the evidence base that we had for interventions that could be effective in supporting learning and development of children with autism so that they could fully participate in the community, in home life and at school. And a lot had changed since the late 70s. Many children were no longer being institutionalised, and there had been an amazing increase in the amount of research that was going on to identify ways in which we could help those individuals who were struggling to learn in inclusive environments in schools, and who were presenting real challenges for parents at home. So my early research career was focused on trying to develop and evaluate interventions that would be effective. And having spent quite a deal of time doing that, I found that when I was going into, I was meeting with parents, I was visiting their homes, and I was also going into schools and early intervention centres, that much of the research that not only I had been doing, but obviously a lot of researchers around the world had been doing to develop these effective interventions, was not getting into practice. There was a big gap. There was a gap between research and practice, and even though we had the technologies, if you like, that could be used to promote learning, that many of those things were not being used. People didn't know about them, or if they did know about them, they didn't have the knowledge and skills in how to implement them. So I then started to focus a lot more on how do we improve implementation? How do we try to work with parents and teachers and educators, allied health professionals, to increase their knowledge and use of practices that we know can be effective? Having done that for some time, I then discovered that not only were, from my own research, but from the research of others, that people were using not only effective practices, but they were often using a combination of interventions. Some of them had good research evidence that they were effective, but some did not. And some even have had research evidence to show that they were ineffective. So I then have been recently focusing on some research where we're looking at not only trying to see how we can increase the use of effective practices, but also how can we decrease the use of ineffective practices. So the project that we've been working on with schools at the moment, we started out by finding out what do teachers think about some of the practices that we've identified that are commonly used in our schools. And the slide that is now up there already is the way in which we've asked staff to identify what do they currently know about certain practices and how do they use them. And for those of you who are interested, I'd ask you just to jot down your responses to those three questions. The first practice that that I've chosen to look at here is sensory integration therapy. These treatments involve establishing an environment that stimulates or challenges the individual to effectively use all of their senses as a means of addressing over or under stimulation. Whoops. You can probably read it better than me from here, from the environment. An example of sensory integration therapy is a sensory diet, providing sensory experiences throughout the day with an aim of meeting the sensory needs of a student with autism. It also includes things like using weighted blankets and a whole range of other sensory materials and using those in the classroom or in the home. So we asked teachers to rate the level of evidence they thought was available to support this type of intervention and to use a scale from 0 to 4, where 0 is virtually it's ineffective according to the evidence, and a 4 is that it's an established evidence-based practice. How often do you intend to use this intervention, and how applicable is this strategy for your classroom? We then looked at antecedent-based intervention. This is interventions that involve arranging events or circumstances that come before a challenging behaviour with the aim of reducing the behaviour. An example of an antecedent-based intervention is using environmental audits. That is where you assess and change the environment so it's supportive of sensory processing challenges in students with autism. And again, we ask the exact three same questions, and you might want to jot down where you sit on those ratings in terms of the level of evidence, your intention to use this, and whether you think it's applicable in the situation in which you're working. I'm just going to park that for a moment and we'll come back to those questions a little later in the presentation. So, autism has been described as a fad magnet. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it does attract a lot of controversial, ineffective, and sometimes even harmful interventions. And fad treatments are often made to sound very scientific. They often claim to cure autism. They often offer a quick fix, and we know that there isn't such a thing as a quick fix, and quite frequently are supported by the only evidence that is given to support those practices is often through testimonials, which, as we know, are not a very reliable or strong type of evidence to support an intervention. So in our practice we have found that when we look at what parents and teachers are using, there's been quite a number of studies around the world, and we've also replicated similar findings in Australia, that parents and professionals are tending to use a combination of practices that we have research to show are ineffective, as well as effective treatments. So why is it important that we deal with this issue? Ineffective treatments, obviously they cost time, they cost money, and those things are being spent on things that we know are not going to lead to the best outcomes. They're not the things that are going to be the most effective for us to be using to promote learning and development. It also has a cost in that while we're putting resources, time, money, effort into using ineffective treatments, it means that's resources that can't be used on effective treatments. So it's a kind of double shot. So in our project that we're working on with schools at the moment, we're taking a two-pronged approach. We're trying to decrease the use of ineffective practices. So in the diagram there, what we show is that if we're going to ask people to stop doing something that they've been doing, it creates a vacuum. So they're going to ask the question, well, what do we do instead? Is there something that is effective that we can use if we're not going to use what we're currently doing? And unless we can replace it with something that is just as effective, then people will revert back to using that ineffective strategy, because it's often easier to use than the more effective strategy, and they already know it, they're already doing it. So there's that tendency to flip back to what they were doing before. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, don't do this, but instead, here's a really good alternative. And we have to make sure that we're doing those things in tandem. We've also found that just telling people the facts about something being ineffective, presenting them with that information in itself is not enough, because by doing that, we've found from other areas of science that it can backfire. And this has particularly been evident when trying to deal with misinformation around vaccinations and the link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And I want to put out there really quickly, we know it's a myth. It's been discredited, the original research has been discredited. There have been many studies conducted since then to demonstrate that there is no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. However, there was a number of very interesting research studies conducted to present 1,700 parents, roughly, with 4 different methods of demonstrating that, presenting them with the factual information about there being no link between the vaccine and autism. And the study showed that by presenting parents with that information, that a significant number of parents increased their intention not to vaccinate their children. So just by telling somebody the facts is not sufficient if that's all we're doing. We have to be careful about how we inform people and let them know that there is misinformation, that that is a myth, because otherwise we get a backfire effect and we find that we might increase people's intention to use something that is ineffective. That was quite a shocking finding, really, and so through that there's been a lot of work done in the cognitive psychology area looking at how do we deal with misinformation more effectively so that we don't get that backfire effect. The second point on the slide there is that not only is there a backfire effect, but even if there is some change in belief as a result of presenting the facts and trying to deal with misinformation in that way, you can get some change for some people, but you can get a rebound effect. What that is that initially they may change their belief, but then later on we test them again in, say, 3 or 4 weeks' time and find that they've reverted back to what they believed in before. So we're worried about that rebound effect as well. So in our research, we're trying to deal with backfiring, rebounding, and filling that vacuum that if we are going to stop using something that's ineffective, what's going to replace it? So in our research, we've created some information sheets about ineffective and effective practices, where we've followed specific strategies known to be useful when you're trying to deal with misinformation and debunking myths. And I'm going to show you the 2 information sheets that we have produced for sensory integration training and antecedent-based interventions, those 2 practices that I showed you at the beginning, where we asked the questions of the teachers about their knowledge and their intended use of those practices. This is what the one on sensory integration therapy looks like, and I'm not sure if it's maybe too detailed to be able to read it, but I'm hoping that you can actually pick up sufficient from it to see that basically what we're doing here is showing the sensory integration therapies as an ineffective practice, and the strategies that we have used from the cognitive sciences around dealing with misinformation. We first of all introduce the practice. We explain why people want to believe it. We make clear that the intervention isn't evidence-based. We detail why it is not evidence-based. We use a graphic representation of the information, and you can see there we've used colour-coded pie charts. And then we introduce a superior intervention, which is the next slide I'll show you. So are you able to read that at all? Can you see the text? No, too small? Okay. That's unfortunate. I was hoping that you'd be able to read some of it, and I certainly can't read it from here. But basically it contains all those things. You can probably see the pie charts quite clearly. The one on the left shows we basically did an extensive review of all of the literature that has claimed to use sensory integration therapy to address specific learning issues and learning and behaviour issues in autism. We went through those, and the blue pie chart on the diagram is showing the number of studies that we identified and the percentages of those which were rated as having sufficient rigour and research quality for us to then look further in terms of what were the findings from those studies. So this is a critical part of the process that we've gone through that sits behind these information sheets, is how we synthesise the research and how we then use a scientific evidence rating system to be able to determine the levels of evidence that the study provides. So we look at the rigour of the research design, we look at the quality of the statistical analysis that have been undertaken, and whether that leads to the conclusions that the authors have drawn from the study, whether those conclusions are valid based on the research design and the quality of the statistical analyses. So it was a very rigorous process where we used a number of raters and blinding, etc., to come up with that. And then the diagram on the right shows of the studies that had sufficient rigour to be considered to look then at the results. It shows that all of those studies in the red found the practices to be ineffective, and those in the yellow had mixed results, meaning that some of the studies, for example, were small sample size, multiple baseline designs, for example, and it could have been that only one of the 5 participants showed significant improvement, whereas the other 4 did not. So we've put those in the yellow, indicating that you need to be very cautious in interpreting those results, because it was not conclusive. Certainly the majority of the participants did not experience significant improvement compared to control groups or whatever. We then have a recommendation at the bottom that based on the current evidence that is available, that there isn't sufficient evidence to move forward with using these interventions, and that we recommend an alternative being the antecedent-based intervention. Exactly the same setup for the antecedent-based intervention information sheet. You'll see we've kept it to a page. It's written in very clear English. We find, for example, when we're working with teachers, they don't have time to synthesise all of the research that we do. They don't have access to this kind of level of information, and they need it because they're wanting to use, they want to know, what should we do? And we need to be able to guide that, but we need to guide it knowing that we're giving them the best opportunities possible through practices that we know that do have some research behind them. So the antecedent-based interventions, you can see we've gone through the same process of the studies that are sitting in the blue. Virtually half of those had sufficient rigour to then look at the results. All of the studies in the green are supportive and showing strong improvements as a result of the use of these strategies, and a small section there of the yellow, which is the mixed results, and nothing in the red. And I think that's reasonably telling, and it shows the contrast. And one of the reasons why we're suggesting that this is an excellent alternative to sensory integration therapies is that antecedent-based interventions can be used really effectively to address sensory issues. So we're not saying here that individuals with autism don't experience significant sensory issues. It's a matter of how can we best help them in their learning to make sure that those sensory issues are not interfering or getting in the way of them being able to maximise their learning opportunities when they're in the classroom, similarly at home. So, having gone through that, we show our teachers that information, and we then ask them the same questions again. And if you're interested in doing that for yourselves, have your ratings changed? What do you think about sensory integration training now after going and looking at the information sheets? And did your ratings change? So our findings, is this approach working? Did you increase or decrease your support for SIT or ABI as a result of my talk? Is this approach working in our research? We've found that teachers that we're working with are reducing their support for ineffective practices, but we are worried about the rebound effect. So what we're looking at now is, does professional development on the alternative strategy reduce or prevent the rebound effect? Because one of the reasons we think rebound happens, well, there's lots of reasons. It's the fact that misinformation keeps coming at you all the time. So even though they've read the sheets, they're still hearing, they've still got professionals coming in and recommending the use of these things, which, these are often people that are quite reputable, that have got, considered to have high qualifications, and they've got parents walking into the classroom with boxes of sensory materials saying, "These, use these in the classroom." They're under a lot of pressure, and in order for them to feel competent and confident to try something else, they need to have the knowledge and skill to do it. So we can't just say, read the sheets and go away and do this. We really need to give them the skills and abilities to be able to use these things. So we have, in previous studies, stopped short and just been trialling our information sheets because we wanted to be sure we weren't getting the backfire effect. We've now found we can use the sheets and we don't get a backfire effect. We're not increasing people's intention to use the ineffective practice, but we are finding that there is the rebound effect. So we're now offering professional development as a way of seeing whether this will counter that rebound effect. And what we've chosen to do is use the environmental audit. We have provided a workshop to a select number of people in each school that we're working with, and then we have used a mentoring model where we train them to train other teachers in their schools in the technique, and so that way we're building capacity within the school about how to do this particular practice. And the strategy is environmental audit, which is a way of assessing aspects of the physical environment that we know have an impact on learning and participation. In particular, we focus in on aspects of noise, temperature, lighting and seating arrangements. And I don't have time to go through in detail, but the workshop, we run through a six-step process of conducting an environmental audit by rating the current situation and identifying areas that might require change. Then we get them over the following week to verify the information that they collect about their audit and to check individual students and their sensory sensitivities with those aspects. Create an action plan for addressing changes in the classroom. Discuss with the principal about the changes and make sure that they've got the resources necessary to implement those changes, and then monitor the changes once they're made to determine whether that's having an impact on the students' learning and behaviour. So next steps. One of the things we think is most critical is that families and professionals have access to up-to-date synthesis of research on what works. And the internet is just so mind-blowing in terms of the information out there, and we can't expect parents and teachers to be able to be sifting through all that and coming up with good choices and the answers in terms of what is effective. But what we've learned is that we can't just stop at saying what's effective. We're going to also have to put up the red flags and be brave and say, and these are not effective things. We don't think you should be using your resources in this way. Please put them over here. We need to therefore be trying to debunk these ineffective practices, and we need to get better at doing it, because those that are peddling some of these ineffective practices are very good at it. And I can go through an enormous list of things that over the last since I was in the field from the late 70s, that have come and gone, that have been suggested as cures for autism. Some of them really frightening. At the moment, the one that's going around is bleach, and I just despair. The dangers of some of these alternative treatments. We need to be so careful and The other thing that we need to be doing is coupling that with making sure that people are being given the skills necessary to be able to use the things that we know can be effective, or they're going to revert to ineffective practices. So that is myself. Please ask questions. I have to slip out after this, but I will be back for the panel, and I look forward to being able to answer your questions, because I know some of the things that I have to say can be a little controversial sometimes. So thank you very much.